The Louis Burke Frumkes Center for Writing and Culture at Hunter College presents 10 years of best-selling authors and great thinkers. Each week we broadcast new videos from our 10-year speaker archive online for free at our website. We look forward to seeing you again when it's safe. Please enjoy this presentation from the archives of the Louis Burke Frumkes Center for Writing and Culture at Hunter College.
My name is Louis Frumkes, and I hope it's nice to see. I see a lot of old friends, but I also see a lot of new faces, and I hope that you have our programs which are on your seats, and that you will come to some of the other Ian Lee and Steve Berry later on, the others of the best-selling author series. And as you may or may not know, we have a great thinkers series, and we started with Edward Whitton the other night. And in April, we have a Nobel laureate, Shelley Glashow, coming, who takes an opposite view from Edward Whitton. And then Alan Guth, one of the great figures in modern science, and he's coming in May. All of our programs, as you know, are free, and we try to have very good refreshments for you and book signings. So you will know at the end of this talk, and we will have Q&A, if you wish to have Lee sign books to your favorite Reacher Creature, you can do that, and they make great gifts. And we don't make anything from the books. The corner bookstore actually does this as a service, which is very nice. We hope you come to these primarily because our main mission in the Writing Center, besides giving courses, which we do charge for, and running our Writers' Conference on Saturday, June 8th, which is a national event, we really wanted the community and the kids and people at Hunter College to be able to access first-class cultural events without having to reach deeply into their pockets or have to travel very north or very south to do it, or buy a whole subscription. And Hunter is a marvelous place, and the continuing ed department has many wonderful offerings, and we want people to be able to take advantage of it, and some of the things we put on, the confluence of the three physicists that are coming occurs with the same rarity as a comet entering the orbit of the Earth. And so it is really a unique opportunity for anyone interested in science. And we are constantly cooking up new fare for you, and we love it when you take advantage of it. That said, maybe people are caught in the hypothetical snowstorm that's coming. And I personally don't believe much in it. Oh, there's a late person now. What do you know? Two late people. I'm glad. 3 late people. Wonderful. It's not snowing yet, is it? Good. Good. What is it? Sleeting. That's a pre-snow. Okay. So let me introduce the speaker. If you are a Reacher Creature, there's probably no need for me to go on explaining who Lee Child is. If you are not a Reacher Creature, you should be. And you should also see the blockbuster Jack Reacher movie with Tom Cruise based on Lee's novel One Shot that opened in December. Lee Child, née Jim Grant, is a British thriller writer who now lives here in the States. He writes books that keep you on the edge of your seat from page 1 until the finish, or when Reacher finishes his mission or catches up with the unlucky villain. Reacher is a low-keyed former American military policeman who looks kind of like Lee Child and travels the world with virtually no baggage except an incisive mind and a hammer fist. Lee Child, on the other hand, won the Anthony Award and the Barry Award for his first Jack Reacher novel, Killing Floor, which, by the way, is reissued with a wonderful new introduction that I read and loved and it's in the back too for if you want to purchase one. And in 2009 was elected president of the Mystery Writers of America. As a youngster, he won a scholarship to the high school which J.R.R. Tolkien had attended. Lee also went to law school in Sheffield, England, and subsequently joined Granada Television in Manchester for what turned into an 18-year career as presentation director during British TV's golden age. Suffice that during his tenure, Granada made Brideshead Revisited, The Jewel in the Crown, Prime Suspect, and Cracker. Since then, Lee has written close to 20 novels, some of which he will be happy to inscribe this evening in the rear of the room. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Lee Child here to Hunter College as part of our 2013 best-selling author series. Lee, if you're still here and not caught in the sleet and snow. And Maggie, there is seats reserved for you.
Yeah, I said to Lewis, so what am I supposed to be doing today? And he said, you know, just leave plenty of time for Q&A, which I like to do, frankly, because the big advantage of Q&A for you is that you've done me the great compliment of coming out tonight when there are much better things to do, like, you know, stay home and eat dinner or something like that. But so it would be a shame if you came out and there were things that you wanted to know and didn't get a chance to find out. And so I'm always very happy to answer questions. The other advantage for me, of course, in that is that you are doing 50% of the work. I don't have to just stand up here and do it all. And so what I normally like to do for fun is make the whole thing Q&A. You know, just do the whole thing Q&A. And ask whatever you want. There are no bad questions. Well, yeah, there are one or two bad questions, but I'm sure you won't ask them. So just to get you in the mood, I'll ask the first question, which is a question that we get a lot, which is, so Lee, when did you know that you wanted to be a writer? And, you know, a lot of authors answer that question. Most of them seem to hit around the age 7 or 8. You know, around the age 7 or 8, they're making up short novellas, handwriting them in exercise books that end up in the bottom drawer and stay there all their lives. And occasionally you get people even younger than that convinced they're going to be writers. My friend Harlan Coben has a riff where he said actually he wanted to be a writer while he was still a fetus. But my answer to that question is I never wanted to be a writer. I still don't want to be a writer. It's something that I just ended up doing. And what I always wanted to do was be an entertainer. And my original plan A for me all those years ago, as a kid in Britain, plan A for me was to join the Beatles. That is really what I wanted to do. And there were, you know, it was a fairly clear path, I thought, except there were 3 problems standing in the way. First of all, there were no vacancies. Second of all, I had no musical talent. And third, I was 9 years old. But in principle, that's what I wanted to do, because I sensed with the Beatles. I mean, the Beatles for a British person were, for a person particularly my age, because I was born in 1954 in Britain. And that was 9 years after World War II, but it was really still in World War II in every way, sort of spiritually, economically, historically. Britain was a country that, at that point, and my earliest memories date from about 1957. I can date my earliest memory to the late 50s easily. And Britain at that point was a gray, exhausted, very dull and worn-out country. Economically ruined, physically battered. As I say, my first memories must be 12 years after the end of World War II. And I absolutely remember playing as a kid in ruined buildings, you know, bombed out buildings that were still there, and strange empty patches of land where a building had fallen down and then been bulldozed and steamrolled. So World War II was totally in our consciousness, especially in the sense of the historical mood that it caused. Because our parents' generation, my parents were youngish people. during World War II and had this amazing, perilous life and death experience. And the mood in Britain at that time was that, as Winston Churchill famously said, this was their finest hour. And it clearly was. But that was no consolation to a young person, because to be told that history was over, that nothing more can possibly happen now, all the good stuff is in the past, it was a fundamentally demoralizing thing for a kid. And it was. I remember being extremely demoralized. I can remember one summer when I was 8 being just sick of everything. And then the Beatles happened. And the Beatles were like night and day, saved our lives completely. The summer of 1963, it was just fabulous. It's suddenly fabulous to be young. And it stayed that way for just a good 10 years. I mean, the 10 years after 63 to 73, there will never be years like those again. It was just wonderful. So, but what I loved about the Beatles was the passion and the enthusiasm and the adoration that they aroused in the audience. And I absolutely wanted some of that. I think it's a classic psychological imperative for any kind of performer. I know lots of performers because, as you heard, and as you will hear, I worked in the theater, I worked in television, I was constantly surrounded by performers, and all performers, and I would include writers as a type of performer, I think all performers are seeking the love and approval that they did not get as children. And certainly that's how I felt. I wanted this showbiz thing. I wanted to look out at those happy, ecstatic faces. So entertainment was what it was always going to be for me, except that I had no talent. That was the fundamental problem. Couldn't sing. I found out that I couldn't sing because the second thing I really fell in love with was the shows that our elementary school put on. It was a very traditional, old-fashioned elementary school. It did reading, writing, and arithmetic, nothing else, to an extremely high standard, in a very formal and old-fashioned way, except that what you call the principal, what we called the headmistress, was a crazy fan of the American musicals. And twice a year, at the winter holidays and in the summer, we would put on a show that was basically all her favorite numbers stitched together with a completely meaningless plot. And I went to see, as a pupil, I went to see one of these shows, and again, it was just so wonderful. These happy kids on the stage, the lights, the beaming audience, the proud parents, it was just great. And so I wanted to be in it. So I went out for the next one, and they handed me a sheet of paper and said, okay, sing this song. And at that point, I did not know that I couldn't sing. You're not born knowing your deficiencies, you find them out. And this was the moment that I found out that I couldn't sing. So I held the sheet, bravely started singing, and in the corner of my eye, I was thinking, why are these people all going pale? And so they said, well, you better be, like a spear carrier. And so after being the spear carrier, I then migrated backstage and essentially stayed backstage. I went to a very fancy high school, and we had a really great theatre group. This was the Midlands of England, not very far from Stratford-on-Avon, and I worked part-time jobs at the Royal Shakespeare Company. I worked at the Repertory Theatre in Birmingham. In fact, so long ago did I start that the way of dating myself is to say the first time I ever worked with Laurence Olivier, he was still in his 60s. It was that long ago. And the theater, I was in the theater basically in the very early 1970s. And that was a great time for theater in one sense. There was a lot of new experimental theater going on, and some of it was extraordinary. Most of it was terrible. And what I really learned, the terrible guys, they were kind of proud of being terrible, and they were proud of the fact that nobody came to see their production, because it proved, obviously, they were so much more advanced than the audience. Nobody understood them and all that kind of thing, which I always used to think was just bullshit. Because to me, seriously, not just talking commercially, but there's something transactional about the nature of entertainment. It's almost like one of those Zen questions. If you put on a show and nobody comes to see it, have you actually put on a show? What those conundrums are like. My favorite being, if a man talks in a forest and his wife is not there to hear him, is he still wrong? That sort of a thing. So if you're putting on a show and nobody comes, are you actually putting on a show? There is some essential element. It's a two-way street. You've got to do something, it's got to be consumed, and then it exists. So I became much more at home with what you would call, certainly I didn't want to do trash, but I wanted people to actually be watching and consuming it and enjoying it. And so I joined Granada Television in Manchester, England, because it seemed to me they were, to be absolutely frank, it seemed to me they were paying a lot of money. That's why I joined them. But the consolation was they were convinced that you do not have to have the lowest common denominator in order to get a big audience. And I was very happy with that. I was doing quality stuff, and we were getting big audiences, and it was an absolutely terrific job. It was a great company, a terrific job, and there's no question that I would still be doing it now, except that one day in 1995, my boss said something to me that made it absolutely impossible for me to continue there. He said, "You're fired." And it was one of those corporate restructuring things where British commercial television had been this very, very odd, regulated thing. Commercial television in Britain was not set up until the middle 50s, and the Conservative government did it, and they did it. In order to do it properly, they came over and studied the situation in the US, and they felt that in the US what you had was ferocious competition in every market that was driving the quality down, which was actually, if you think about it, a strange conclusion to come to about commercial television in the US in the 1950s. If you look back, I mean, you had symphonies. CBS would carry symphonies in peak time. You had tremendous stuff, but actually it was not evidently not quality enough for the British government, and so they produced this system where there would be a commercial station in every market, but only one of them, so that they had nobody to compete against, so that the quality would not be driven downward. So that in New York City you would have one commercial station, and in Chicago you would have one station. That was the equivalent. And of course that is a monopoly, obviously. And of course, therefore, the stations were charging an absolute fortune for their airtime, and they were making obscene profits, which was a slight embarrassment to, I mean, this is a long time ago when conservatives were able to be embarrassed. They were embarrassed at the level of profiteering, and so they introduced this regulation which said that they were quite happy to countenance outrageous profits, but if you moved from outrageous to obscene, they had this levy in place that was essentially 100% tax above a certain profit level. The idea being that that money would therefore have to be diverted into programming and people, which it was. And so that's why I enjoyed it so much. We were very well paid. We had infinite resources. We had, they were very patient with things. They would, because they were making so much money on the staples and the soap operas and stuff, they were happy to countenance all kinds of experiments. It was a really nice atmosphere, but it came to an end when the modern day conservatives under, the Thatcher government, Thatcher had no ideological problem with obscene profits. And so she removed all this regulation and dismantled it all, so they were free to do whatever they wanted. So, of course, their first instinct was to fire all the old guys who had big salaries and benefits and pensions and all that kind of stuff, and bring in young guys who would work for a quarter of the money. And, of course, by then, sadly, I was an old guy. I was 39 years old, totally washed up. So I was fired. And 39, I was very nearly 40, so call it 40, it was an unfortunate time to be fired because it was just slightly too far away from, say, 60 to actually retire. I would have been very happy to, but I couldn't see bridging that gap. You felt somewhat weary about the idea of having to start over and apply for another job. So I was sitting there and I thought, what can I do? What can I do for the rest of my life? And I thought, I know, I'll write a book. I've read some. How hard can it be? And when I say I'd read some, I mean, actually, yeah, I'd read probably tens of thousands. I was, again, it's a generational thing. We had, really very little going on as kids in terms of entertainment. Everybody read, literally everybody. Even the ones that couldn't read really tried very hard, and they would carry comic books. If they couldn't manage regular books, they would certainly have comic books, or what we now call graphic novels. And there was no stigma whatsoever involved with reading. Before I went to the fancy high school, I was in a very rough neighborhood, and these guys, I mean, literally we carried, in your pocket you would have a switchblade and a book. Everybody had a book, and so I'd been reading all my life, loved reading, loved books, loved immersing myself in that whole world. But curiously, I had never ever asked myself, where do these books come from? I had no conception at all of somebody writing them and then publishing them. For me, they were just there to be consumed. And so really very late on in my 30s, it suddenly occurred to me, somebody writes these, and that could be fun, that could be cool, that could be a good thing to do. So I thought, well, I'll give it a try. I figured I was savvy enough about media and media people, I could probably fool somebody for a couple of years and maybe do a couple of books, and that would put off having to get the next job for 2 years. So that was my intention, and it snowballed from there really to the point where now I'm writing my 18th book. It'll be out in September, and I'm beginning to believe maybe I won't have to get that other job. Maybe this is it. So that's a brief overview, and I think, to be honest, as a writer, one of the key things in that is that I did not intend to be one. I was not in any way, I had no preconceptions, I wasn't boxed in, I wasn't subject to a lifetime of expectation of how it ought to be or how I thought it would be. I came to it very late, almost as an arbitrary decision with no concept at all of what you should do or what you ought to do or how you ought to do it, and I think that made me very flexible and very willing to just do what needed to be done, and very unashamed, frankly, of wanting to be read. Again, to me a book is a two-way thing. It's a collaborative thing. I write it, you read it, then it exists. It's the product of my imagination and your imagination working together, which I found really, really attractive after television, because the problem with television is that it's teamwork, and that is really nice in as much as you're working with bright, fun people, and socially and intellectually it's very stimulating. But you're curiously isolated from the result. If the thing works really well, you can't really take the credit because 100 other people were involved. If it's a total failure, you can't really blame yourself because 100 other people were involved. Whereas writing, I mean, absolutely, there are editors, publicists, there are publishers, bookstores, there's a long chain of very dedicated people, but fundamentally, it's one-on-one. If you're reading my book, your brain is hardwired to my brain for some hours at a time. And if the book is crap, then absolutely, that is my fault. And if you enjoy it, then absolutely, yeah, that's my achievement. And I liked that directness very much as an antidote. Although as a practical thing, it's a lonely life. Whereas before I was used to working in this boisterous team full of fun people, now I work completely alone all day, every day, accompanied by nobody except people that I'm making up in my head. It's a very weird life. So does anybody have any questions? Oh, great, fantastic. In the back there.
Hold on. Let's use a microphone.
I was just curious how you first met Jack Reacher.
How I first met him? Well, that's a good question because, let's go back over the circumstances. I was broke, I was out of work. I'm not a saver at all. I'm not a financially responsible person. I'm not an adult in that sense whatsoever. So I was fired. They paid me off, they gave me some money to leave. And by the time I'd settled a few debts, I had 7 months living money. And therefore, it was really desperate, really urgent. I'll just backtrack one, just to illustrate how urgent it was. I'll just backtrack to something else. The last 2 years that I was in that television job, as well as my day job as a director, I was also the shop steward of the union. And these were very times of big upheaval. And the way that they were going to introduce this upheaval was to bust the union. That's what they typically do. And the way they were going to bust the union was they put out this whisper. The shop steward, as was this old guy, and he'd been steward for many years, and he was about to retire. And they put out the word that if anybody stood for election to replace him, that person would be fired within a week and never work in the industry again. That was their tactic, and it worked. The guy was retiring, the nomination sheet stayed blank, and I walked past it on my way to work one morning, and this blank sheet of paper, and I thought, this is not right. So I put my name forward to be shop steward, and immediately that same morning, some manager came to see me and said, you'll be fired within a week. You'll never work in the industry again. And I said, we'll see about that, asshole. And that 1 week turned into 2 years and 3 months before they eventually fired me. And it was guerrilla warfare the whole time. It was just magnificent, really. I mean, you can't really fight physically as a grown-up like you did as a kid, but I love fighting. And to me now, that's translated into a kind of intellectual thing, arguing. And it was just 2 years and 3 months of just endless battling, and I loved every minute of it. But it did mean at the end I was definitively unemployable in television, which was the only thing I knew anything about. So this 7 months and the book career, it had to work. So you would think under that situation you're going to think very carefully about the book you're going to do and the character that you're going to create. You're going to think, I need to make him appealing. I need to make him appealing to different demographics. I've got to have women involved here because women are very important in book buying. On the other hand, I've got to have young men who are you've got to cover all the bases. But if you start thinking like that, then you are totally lost, because that's the one thing I did learn in the media above all else, is that you cannot ever design a success. You can't plan it, you can't design it, you can't guarantee it, and if you try to, it will definitely be a failure. Successes only happen by accident, and nobody really knows how or why. So I knew enough of that to, even though it was desperate circumstance, I just had to say, just close your eyes and write whatever occurs to you. Don't even think twice about, is it going to be popular? Because if you go down that road, you start hedging, you start compromising, and you're lost. Just write from the heart. And that's what I did. And without even thinking about it, Jack Reacher came out. And I read through that first book, and I thought, God, I'm happy with it, but let's think about it. He's this filthy, dirty barbarian. He never changes his clothes. He shoots people in the back. He lies and cheats and steals. I thought, this is a disaster. Nobody's going to like this guy. But because I think he was written with honesty, warts and all, people did like him. But where he came from, I mean, I didn't want to know, really, because I was worried about breaking the bubble. I didn't want to think about it in case I started to overanalyze it. But I suppose after 3-4 years, then I could afford to. I was secure in the voice, and so I did start to think about it. And clearly, he can only be a product of things that I've read before. And sure enough, he really is. He is. He's a modern version of a very ancient character, the knight errant, the mysterious stranger, which has showed up all the way through narrative history. We tend to think of the mysterious stranger as an American Western thing. And absolutely, that character was right there in the Westerns, but it was not invented by the Westerns. It was imported by the Westerns from a much older tradition that occurred in Europe in the Middle Ages, the mysterious stranger who has no explicable past, he has no prospect of a future, he just exists in the present, and he is there to, when you are at the end of your rope, when you are in deep trouble, this guy shows up, solves your problem, and then crucially moves on. He rides off into the sunset. No gratitude issues. You know, he's just there when you need him, and then he's gone. And that character has existed for thousands of years, and what I had done, evidently, is just make a new version of him. So, you know, basically that's why it was a success, because he's been road tested for 3,000 years.
Gentleman over here.
Because you invited any question, I want to ask a little more difficult question. My experiences are opposite to yours, continental in Europe. And why Great Britain, in high standards in law, could in show business, like BBC, left-oriented television, harbored a person, and a typical pedophiliac who had 400 victims. And at the same time, in Great Britain, you attacked conservative forces like Catholic Church. Example, Cardinal O'Brien. Now this is the Seville conclave and in Rome. It's this. And my question is, how could it be happen like this? Double standard in a very strict and high standard of British law. This is my question. Of course, this is not only in your country.
Well, I think, you know, actually, I don't think it is a double standard. I think that it's the two things are pretty much the same. You know, the problem is Britain, as a background issue, Britain is subject to all kinds of mythology, and the idea that Britain has a particularly high standard of law or legal system or morality or ethics is entirely erroneous. You know, Britain is not like that. Britain, at one point, 150 odd years ago, 100 years ago, Britain ruled a third of the world's surface and a quarter of the world's population, the biggest empire that history has ever seen. And they did not do that by being nice or decent people. They did that by being very vicious and manipulative and exploitative. And so the idea that Britain has some kind of morality or high standards of law or legal system is not particularly true. And the BBC harboring the pedophile, his name was Jimmy Savile, notorious, now revealed as a notorious pedophile over many decades. And you know, the Catholic Church harboring various priests, that's one and the same thing. You know, a big national institution covers its ass, and these things tend to come out way too late.
Thank you for answering the question, Lee. Could I ask most of you to try and confine your questions to Lee's literary output or to the books? Yes, young lady.
Hi. Ever since high school, which is many centuries ago, I've had problems reading a book and then seeing a movie. Did you have any problem with the translation from page to film?
Well, that's also a great question, because, you know, because it's been somewhat on my mind over the last couple of years. And, you know, my answer is no. In principle, I don't have a problem with it at all, because in my mind, it's very clear that the two things are entirely separate and really have to be entirely separate. I think it's, you know, the question of which actor should play your character on the screen is a multi-layered question. You know, there's the sort of down and dirty real-world question. Who's available? Who can raise the financing? Who understands the genre? Who can do this type of movie? And at that down and dirty level, then, you know, for me, I was thrilled with Tom Cruise, because he ticked all those boxes, and I think he did a wonderful job in and of itself as a movie. Then you get a kind of the existential layer of that question is that I actually believe that a literary fictional character that exists in a book, like Jack Reacher, that is really a product of your imagination. You know, like I said, it's a transaction. I'm providing a stimulus, you're providing a response, And between us, we have created this character that exists in your mind. And then to take something out of the purely imaginary realm and move it into the real world, because for all that we, all the truth about Hollywood, it's the real world. These are real physical humans in real physical spaces. So it's moved now from the imagination to reality. And I personally think it is always impossible to match those two. Even the most perfect casting cannot satisfy everybody's imagination, so casting is always a problem. But it's not a big problem, and it's not really a meaningful problem, as long as we're all clear that the film is a version of the book that is parallel. The issue for me, the real problem for me, happens because I think, generally speaking, most people don't believe that they are parallel. And here's something very illustrative that happens to us all. If you're ever on a plane and you have a chatty seatmate and you're foolish enough to talk to them, they say to you, "So what do you do?" And you say, "I'm a writer." And then I guarantee 100% of the time, their next line is, "Oh, have any of your books been made into movies?" Because to people that are not centrally concerned with books, to people, the sort of people who, books are not particularly the center of their lives, they have this casual feeling that it's a linear process, it's sequential, that a book is somehow just a chrysalis. A book is a pupa, it's sort of waiting, and a book is not really there, it's not proper, it hasn't really made it until it's become a movie. And so it's a linear process where there's a book and then there's a movie, and the fact that the movie is there at the end of the chain obliterates what came before. So for a lot of people, the movie becomes the version, the definitive version. It trumps the book. And that is where the problems come in, because, absolutely, Tom Cruise does not look like Jack Reacher, not the Reacher that I imagine. But to have him do a version is fine. And to me, it was a fun experience. It was a great experience. And I personally think it was a great movie, as a movie. So I've got nothing bad to say about it at all, other than I can't honestly get that excited about it because I'm the book guy. And this movie is like way off to the side. And there's a lot of stuff way off to the side. You get all kinds of bizarre things happen. The books are what I do, and there's all kinds of stuff sort of on the shoulders of the road, as it were. There was a thrash metal band in Poland some years ago. They wanted to do an album where each song was one of the Reacher books, as a 5-minute thrash metal song. And, they said, would I mind? And I said, no, knock yourself out. And they would keep sending the lyrics, which meant nothing because I can't read Polish. And apparently they made this album where the first 12 books are songs on this thrash metal album. And that's way off to the side somewhere. And people name their children. I was on tour. Last time I did a big tour, I had in two separate cities, a family group would come up with this little baby. And funnily enough, it was always the father that was, the spokesperson here. And they would show me the birth certificate. This kid had been named Jack Reacher Smith or whatever. All that stuff is off to the side. And so, in my visual imagination, I'm on this railroad track, which are the books, and all this stuff happens to the side of me, and I don't care really. But the problem is other people do care. The common view is that the book is somehow supplanted by the movie. And intellectually, I have a hard time getting to grips with that feeling. And so I have a hard time getting that upset about who plays him. I don't care, It's nothing to do with the book. I don't mind who plays him. And for a certain extent, to the person that's written the book, and I really do not want to be pretentious about this at all, so forgive me using this example, but suppose I was Bob Dylan, and I'd written a song, and my manager called me and said, somebody wants to do a cover version of your song. I would say, sure. And what would I want to hear out of this cover version? I would not want to hear a kind of note-for-note replica of my song because I've already done that. You know, why would I need to hear it imitated? What I would want to do is hear the Jimi Hendrix version. Somebody doing it radically differently, somebody doing a fresh take on it. So I think from the artist's point of view, they don't particularly want fidelity. I would rather see somebody else's radical vision than a kind of replica of how it appears to me.
Young lady here. No, right up there, back, right next to you.
I'm a teacher, I don't need this. This is a comment, not a question, forgive me. I had never heard of you, Mr. Child, till I saw the movie, which was in December. This afternoon, I finished my 11. My husband's up to 13 already. And I would ask this audience something, because I argue with my friends about this. If you were to cast it, what actor would you have picked? I mean, is there a 6'5" actor other than that wrestler?
The gentleman right in back of you has Harrison Ford.
He's a little old. What, are you kidding me? Oh.
Yeah. You know, first of all, thank you very much for seeing the movie, and thank you for their going on to buy and read the books. And I have to say, that was the plan. And, you know, evidently it worked well with you. But you know, the casting, as you can imagine, has been a big subject for a long time. And like I said to the other lady, everybody has a completely different construct, and people quite passionately and quite convincingly say this is their guy, and it's completely different from everybody else's guy. And then, of course, you come up against the fact that they're suggesting people who are, some of them are 100 years old, and some of them are actually dead. You know, finding an actor is something that is pretty much impossible to do. And interesting what you said, 6'5" actors. There are none. There are no 6'5" actors. Actors tend to be very small. And, you know, forgive me for being obsessive about this, but, you know, this has been my life for 2 years, talking about Tom Cruise. And he is a small guy, there's no question about it. Actually not a midget, but I was very uptight the first time I met him because, you know, he'd been yakking about all this stuff for months, and then I had to meet with him, and the issue had built up huge in my head, and I thought, oh my God, I'm going to be walking in there going, oh, hi, Tom. I was just paralyzed at the thought of it, but actually he's a perfectly normal-sized guy. I mean, really, a perfectly normal-sized person, and he is. There's a spread, you know. You've got to have what they call an A-list actor, somebody that's capable of commanding the finance and opening the movie for a strong first weekend. So you're already down to a very limited number of possibilities. And the truth of the matter is that everything you ever hear about an actor's height is a lie. All that PR stuff, all their press releases, their bios, Wikipedia, it's all lies. The only people that actually know for sure how tall an actor is the wardrobe mistress, because they have to know, because they fit the clothes. And so I know, now I do anyway, I know several wardrobe mistresses, and one of them told me that the truth of the matter is that in terms of A-list actors, the difference between the tallest and the shortest right now is 4 inches. Now, is that really worth getting upset about? And people say, oh, but, you know, Clint Eastwood, he was a big guy. Clint Eastwood was not a big guy. He kind of looked big, but he wasn't. I was at Warner Brothers in the summer and having this conversation with a wardrobe mistress, and she said, wait a minute. And she disappeared for about 20 minutes. She'd gone back into their climate-controlled warehouse, and she came back with the tweed jacket that Clint Eastwood wears in Dirty Harry. Remember that costume? It's a tweed jacket, gray flannel pants. This was his costume, and she said, try this on. And I couldn't get it on. You know, the sleeves were like there and way too small and tight. Clint Eastwood looks like a big person, but he's really not. None of them are big people. And you have to ask yourself why. Now, in television, I was very used to that. Television has, you know, television is not precisely optical like a movie. Television builds a picture with horizontal lines. That's why everybody looks 10 pounds fatter on television, because the emphasis is horizontal. You know, it's like if you wear a horizontal stripe on your sweater, you better be pretty skinny. Better to wear a vertical stripe. So television makes people look a little heavier than they really are. So typical television actor is a tiny person with a very large head. That's just universally true. And movies, they're still small people, and they tend to have large, vivid heads. And there has to be a reason for that, because you said there are no 6'5" actors. Actually, there has never been a 6'5" actor. Now, why is that? In 100 years of cinema, why have we never had a giant actor? And it must be because they somehow don't look good on the camera, or they don't fit well on the set, or just doesn't look right. But actors self-select as relatively compact people. So this whole argument has driven me crazy, because you've got these passionate flame wars going on between, there's this guy who is 8 inches shorter than Reacher, got to be better than this other guy who's 8.5 inches shorter than Reacher. And I'm like, they're all tiny, get over it.
To illustrate Lee's point, I'm on television right now. This lady right here.
This guy's been waiting for a real long
Okay.
time right here.
I was warned not to ask this question because you would get upset about the Tom Cruise business. But I think there's more to it than that. Jack Reacher, to me, I've read of every one of them, is like a noble character. There's nothing noble about Tom Cruise. I mean, I believe all that stuff about throwing his clothes away and just wearing what he's got. But he seems to be like a knight. He has a purpose, and he always finds trouble, because that's what you do if you're a hero. And he deals with it. And when he leaves, you feel, boy, I'm sorry this is over. This is yeah. And here's this guy, I don't care what size he is, but he's just, to me, you picked it. I'm a little insulted by this guy playing a noble character. I realize that if someone had never read the books, they don't know what to expect. But there's a large group of people who really like Jack Reacher, and they feel cheated. I mean, the people I've spoken to.
Well, I hear what you're saying, and that kind of goes, I'm not going to get upset about the question, and I hope you won't get upset about my answer, but why the hell do you feel cheated? You've got the books, you've read the books. What I used to say to people, I'll guarantee you one thing, Tom Cruise will not come to your house and steal your books. You've got the books, you've read the books, you know the story, you know who did it, you know how he did it, you know why he did it, you know everything about the book, maybe you've read it twice. Why are you interested in the movie? Why does the movie have any impact on your life? If you consume the book, it sounds to me almost as if you are then going to the movies expecting to see a better version or a definitive version or something like that. If you've enjoyed the book, stick with it. That's enough. If you are not particularly a book person, which sadly most of the world isn't, then by all means go see the movie. But for somebody who is passionate about the book to then kind of get upset because the movie is not the same makes no sense. Pick a side. Are you a book person or a movie person? If the books are enough for you, then enjoy them and don't even bother with the movie.
Let's give someone else a chance. This woman first.
I have two things. One is that, wasn't John Wayne like 6'3" or something? 6'4", John Wayne. Okay, so that's one.
Dead.
But he died? Oh, no. Anyway, my question is, do you have a routine? You get up at a certain time, you walk the dog, you write until and you get out or meet somebody for lunch. I mean, do you have something that works for you? Or
Well, sadly, all my dogs are dead. I had 2 dogs sequentially, and they both wore out. My daughter then had a dog that was like my grand dog, or my substitute dog, and he died. So I'm completely dogless at the moment, so I don't get out and walk the dog. I mean, I do have a routine, but it's it's a bit of a shameful one, really. I have one motto in my life that I stand by, which is that nothing of value is ever achieved in the morning. So I never work in the morning. I typically, because in television, it was a round-the-clock thing, 24/7 thing, where we were shift workers, and sometimes I would have to start real early, sometimes finish real late, or work all night or whatever. And so I thought, you know what, under the new career, the one consolation I'm going to give myself is I'll work when I damn well choose. And so I typically get up at, usually somewhere between 10:30 and 11. I then I then read in the morning. That's the first thing I always do, read while I have what I call the great English breakfast, which is 5 cups of coffee and 6 camels. Read for an hour or two, then I'll start work around 1 o'clock, maybe 2 o'clock, and then depending on what stage I'm at, I'll do maybe till 6 or 7, which is not a very long or arduous day, but the problem is that I could absolutely work longer. I could work 12, 24 hours if I had to, but there's a certain point at which the quality just drops a little tiny bit, and so you've got to learn to recognize that point and stop there. There's no point in continuing, and for me that's around 5-6 hours maximum. So then, and then later in the book, like where I am at the moment, then I'll probably go back to it at maybe 11 or midnight and work till 2 or 3 in the morning. And so I'm pretty much a night person, but it's a job. It's a hard thing to say this, because absolutely it's a delightful career, and it's creative and it's artistic and all that good stuff, but it's also a job, and you have to maintain discipline. You can't just say, oh well, I'll write when the muse takes me, because if you say that, you'll never write. You've got to sit down and do it.
I am aware that there are many, many questions. We're going to take 2 more, and then the rest of you can follow Lee back to where he's going to be inscribing books, and you can ask him there. Gentleman over here, Axelrod.
Why there were British versions and American versions, and other than the cover and sometimes the title, is there content difference? Is running around Coventry instead of Dallas? What's the difference?
No, I mean, really what happened, there's one text, and what you do is then you sell it to separate publishers all around the world as completely separate deals, so that the British publisher who buys the book, that is unique to them. That's an event unique to them. And, you sell the same book in Yugoslavia or in Bulgaria or something like that. That's unique to them. That's their deal. And so they will prepare their own jacket according to what they think works for their local market. And they will, obviously, if it needs translating, they will handle that. And what the British do, actually, is they change the spelling to British spelling, which is, why they do that, I don't know. I mean, I think it was partly at the beginning a marketing thing that I was a British author, so they wanted to make, even though conceptually it was an import from the US, they wanted to make it somehow that the British had a claim on me or something like that. So they have a computer program which changes all the words back to English, which works pretty well, except, sometimes it doesn't. Like, if you mention Colorado, it'll come out as Colorado. And all that kind of stuff. But the British do that. I've never changed the content ever. As far as I'm concerned, it's one text. And the only time I ever changed the context, I think, was the second book, where just for some reason, Reacher says, there's something about the Germans, and Reacher says, oh, I hate the Germans. And for the German deal for that book, I changed it to, oh, I love the Germans.
How about, I don't know, it's hard to choose. This lady and then that gentleman, and that's it.
On that same line, how did you develop such a genuine American voice?
Well, thanks for saying that it is. And really, that's absolutely the fascination of being a writer. We just love words, and we love language, and we love nuance. And the voice came from, basically, I've been married to an American woman since the middle of the 19th century, it feels. And so all my, I got married when I was 20 to this American woman, and really every trip for many years was always a trip here to, visit with her family or whatever. And as I said, in television, we had a lot of imported shows, a lot of American stuff, a lot of American movies, obviously, and it's meat and drink. You just love it. You're just fascinated by the sound and the nuance and the the subtleties. And so it's not, people assume that it's difficult because I come from Britain and I'm writing about America in an American voice, an American setting. They assume that's somehow difficult. And it's actually not. It's easier because you have the joy and the liberty of every single word you are immersing yourself in. Every single word needs to be thought about carefully. If I was writing about Britain, then you would be constantly yo-yoing between the parts you're making up and the parts you can rely on already knowing. And I think that would be actually a more lumpy sort of transition and actually not as much fun.
Gentlemen, and that'll be the last question for now.
Based on the sales of the book, did you tend to see that people actually went out and bought the book and read it prior to going to the movie, or were people motivated to purchase the book after they saw the movie?
Well, you know, that's easy enough to quantify because what they call the tie-in edition, the paperback movie version, came out, I think, about 6 weeks before the movie, and sold really, really well. It was a #1 paperback on the New York Times, but why? Why did it? And I think that's just because it's a marketing thing in and of itself. It's suddenly there in the rack at the airport, and subliminally it's saying, somebody's made a movie out of this, it must be worth it. And so people bought it without having seen the movie because the movie wasn't out yet. But then equally people, I think the major sale comes from after the movie is out. Partially if you've gone to see the movie like that lady, that's great, but just the fact that the movie's there, it's constantly lodging the name in people's memory, so then they wander past the bookstore and they see it and they say, oh yeah, that thing, and they try it. And so certainly the bulk of the numbers were after the movie was released. Very gratifying for me. I think a few weeks ago I had 6 paperbacks on the New York Times list, which is better than a poke in the eye with a sharp stick. And so yeah, I would say the whole noise surrounding the movie just brings it into people's consciousness, but numbers-wise, definitely later rather than earlier.
Thank you, Lee, for a wonderful...